February 11th, 1968, Quang Nam Province, Vietnam. First Lieutenant Marcus Coleman squinted through the shattered windshield of his M35 cargo truck, visibility reduced to less than 20 yards in the driving monsoon rain. Intelligence had reported North Vietnamese army units massing in the limestone cave networks that honeycombed the mountains west of Da Nang. What should have been a 12-man reconnaissance patrol had dwindled to 7 Marines after their lead vehicle hit a mine. Coleman's orders were explicit: locate and report, do not engage. By nightfall, 5 Marines would be dead, an entire NVA battalion would be destroyed, and Marcus Coleman would perform an act so audacious that military historians still debate whether it represented tactical brilliance or suicidal madness. The radio crackled with static as Captain Howard's voice cut through the downpour. Badger 6 to Recon 1. Satellite imagery shows increased activity near grid coordinates Whiskey Tango 473. Investigate but maintain distance. These caves have multiple entrances. Do not enter without backup. Coleman acknowledged the order, placing the handset back into its cradle. Beside him, Lance Corporal Thomas Ramirez shifted uncomfortably, rainwater dripping from his helmet onto an M60 machine gun balanced across his knees. "Something feel off about this one, sir." Coleman didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on navigating the narrow jungle track that wound between karst formations jutting from the earth like prehistoric teeth. After 23 months in country, he'd developed what the Vietnamese called Mat Thuba, the third eye, an almost supernatural sense for ambush. The third eye was screaming now. 300 yards away, hidden in the dense vegetation along a limestone ridge, Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thinh watched the American vehicles through Soviet-made binoculars. The 27-year-old commander of the 4th Battalion, 308th Division, had been fighting since he was 17, first against the French, now against the Americans. Under his command, 276 soldiers waited in the cave system's primary chamber, with another 64 positioned at secondary entrances. The intelligence officer beside him whispered through the downpour, "They are not following the usual patrol route, Comrade Lieutenant. They appear to be heading directly toward entrance 3. Thinh lowered his binoculars, his expression unreadable. "The Americans have become predictable. They send aircraft first, then artillery, then troops. Today they send only trucks. Something has changed." He considered his options. The cave system had withstood American bombing for 3 years. His men were well supplied, with enough ammunition and rice for 60 days. Moving now would expose them to air attack. "Let them come closer," Thinh decided. "Prepare the forward positions. If they discover entrance 3, we will spring the trap." The rain intensified as Coleman's 3-vehicle convoy rounded a bend in the track. Ahead, a steep cliff face rose almost 90 feet, striated with erosion patterns that had, over millennia, carved deep recesses into the limestone. Lance Corporal Ramirez pointed toward the largest opening, a dark moor, almost 15 feet high, partially concealed by vegetation. "That's big enough to drive through, Lieutenant." Coleman nodded, raising his binoculars. The cave entrance was larger than anything intelligence had briefed them on. He scanned the surrounding terrain, noting disturbed earth and vegetation patterns inconsistent with natural growth. The brush showed signs of regular movement, paths too wide for wildlife, too narrow for vehicles. Bootprints in the mud, partially washed away by the rain, led toward the entrance. Coleman keyed his radio. "Recon 1 to Badger 6. We've located what appears to be a primary entrance. Significant foot traffic. Request permission to approach and assess." The radio crackled. "Negative, Recon 1. Maintain observation distance. Battalion is sending Echo Company to your position. ETA 90 minutes. Coleman acknowledged, but something caught his eye. A glint of metal from the cave entrance, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. He raised his binoculars again, focusing on the darkness beyond the entrance. Nothing. Then movement, a shadow detaching from other shadows. Someone was watching them from just inside the cave. "Contact imminent," Coleman said quietly, turning to Ramirez. "Get on the radio. Tell the other vehicles to maintain distance and establish overwatch positions. I'm going to—" The world exploded. The distinctive crack of AK-47s echoed from the ridge above them as rounds pinged off the truck's hood and fenders. Coleman threw the vehicle into reverse just as the windshield disintegrated, showering both men with safety glass. Ramirez swung the M60 toward the ridgeline and returned fire, the heavy machine gun's rhythmic thunder momentarily drowning out the incoming rounds. "Go, go, go!" Ramirez shouted, feeding another belt into the weapon. Coleman had already made the calculations no combat leader wants to make. Their position was exposed. The other two vehicles in the patrol were taking fire from multiple directions. The ridge above them hosted at least a platoon-sized element, and the cave represented the only cover within reach. Instead of reversing further, Coleman slammed the truck into first gear and accelerated toward the cave entrance. Ramirez turned, eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, what are you—" "Hold on!" Coleman shouted as the truck bounced over broken ground, accelerating toward the dark moor. The firing intensified as NVA soldiers realized his intention. Rounds ricocheted off the truck's armor plating and punctured the radiator. Steam mixed with rain as Coleman hunched over the wheel, foot pressed to the floor. Inside the cave, Senior Lieutenant Thin received reports of the firefight with growing concern. The Americans had been engaged prematurely, an overeager sentry firing without orders. Now, instead of withdrawing as doctrine predicted, one vehicle was charging directly toward Entrance 3. This violated every tactical principle. Americans never willingly entered cave systems. Their entire strategy was built around superior firepower in open terrain. "Seal Entrance 3, Thin ordered. "Move the .50 caliber to the inner chamber." His radio operator looked up, confusion evident. "Comrade Lieutenant, they are driving into the entrance, one vehicle. They will be inside before we can—" Coleman's truck smashed through the hastily arranged brush, concealing the entrance, headlights illuminating a tunnel wide enough for two vehicles side by side. The engine roared as they penetrated 50 yards into the limestone, rounds still pinging off the rear of the vehicle. Ahead, Coleman could make out NVA soldiers scrambling to position a heavy machine gun on a natural stone platform. "Target 2 o'clock!" Coleman shouted. Ramirez opened fire with the M60, forcing the NVA gunners to abandon the weapon. The truck skidded on the smooth limestone floor as Coleman fought to maintain control, plunging deeper into the cave system. The tunnel widened suddenly into a massive chamber. Coleman's headlights swept across an underground base of operations. Wooden platforms had been constructed at different levels, connected by bamboo ladders. Supply crates were stacked 10 feet high in some areas. Cooking fires burned in stone pits. And everywhere the stunned faces of North Vietnamese soldiers frozen in disbelief as an American truck burst into their sanctuary. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then hundreds of AKs were raised simultaneously. "Flamethrower!" Coleman shouted. Ramirez reached behind their seats, dragging forward an M2 flamethrower, technically prohibited for this mission, but Coleman had insisted on bringing it as emergency equipment. As the first rounds began to pepper their vehicle, Ramirez connected the final hose to the fuel tanks and passed the weapon to Coleman. "Cover me," Coleman ordered, throwing open his door and rolling out onto the cave floor. Ramirez laid down suppressive fire with the M60 as Coleman scrambled toward the nearest stack of crates, the heavy flamethrower slowing his movements. The crates were marked in Cyrillic, Soviet ammunition supplies. Beside them stood barrels of fuel for portable generators. Coleman triggered the flamethrower, a stream of jellied gasoline erupting from the nozzle and engulfing the supplies. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Ammunition began cooking off as the flames spread to fuel barrels. Secondary explosions rippled through the chamber. Senior Lieutenant Thin had never seen such madness. One American had turned their impregnable base into an inferno within seconds. Ammunition cooked off in deadly arcs, cutting down his own men. Fuel barrels exploded, sending burning liquid spattering across wooden platforms that caught fire instantly. The cave's natural ventilation system, so effective at removing cooking smoke, now created a chimney effect that intensified the flames. "Withdraw to the secondary chambers," Thin ordered, but the command came too late. The fire had reached a cache of white phosphorus grenades. The resulting explosion filled the main chamber with burning particles that clung to everything they touched, impossible to extinguish. Coleman fought his way back to the truck through chaos and flame, the flamethrower's tanks nearly empty. Ramirez reached down, hauling him into the vehicle as secondary explosions rocked the cavern. With visibility reduced to near zero by smoke and flying debris, Coleman put the truck in reverse and began backing out the way they'd entered, using the cave walls as guides. Outside, the remainder of Coleman's patrol had established defensive positions and radioed for emergency extraction. When Coleman's truck emerged from the cave entrance, smoke pouring from the engine compartment and bullet holes peppering every surface, the Marines initially held their fire, unable to believe what they were seeing. Lance Corporal Ramirez tumbled from the passenger seat, coughing violently, his uniform singed and torn. Coleman remained at the wheel, hands locked in position, 1,000-yard stare fixed on some distant point. It took 2 Marines to pry his fingers from the steering wheel. Black smoke billowed from the cave entrance as ammunition continued to cook off inside. No pursuing forces emerged. Within 30 minutes, helicopter gunships arrived, followed by a medical evacuation team. Coleman and Ramirez were the only survivors from their vehicle. The official after-action report would describe the encounter as a limited engagement with enemy forces utilizing an improvised cave network for temporary shelter. The reality, pieced together from intelligence gathered in subsequent weeks, told a different story. The cave system had housed the command center for NVA operations across 3 provinces. Senior Lieutenant Thin was among the 243 confirmed casualties. Ammunition and supplies that would have sustained operations for months were destroyed. Marine Corps leadership was divided on how to respond to Coleman's actions. He had disobeyed direct orders, risked his entire unit, and violated protocols on flamethrower usage. He had also, through a combination of desperation and audacity, achieved what multiple bombing campaigns had failed to accomplish. General Lewis Wallace, commander of 3rd Marine Division, reviewed the case personally. His handwritten note on the file read simply, "Sometimes the only sane response to an insane situation is an action that appears at first glance to be equally insane." 3 weeks after the incident, still recovering from burns and smoke inhalation, First Lieutenant Marcus Coleman received notification of both a Silver Star and a formal reprimand, military recognition of an action simultaneously heroic and reckless. Decades later, retired Colonel Thomas Ramirez still maintained that what happened in that cave was neither heroic nor reckless, but something altogether different. The textbooks call it tactical innovation under extreme duress, he told military historians at a symposium in 2007. That's a fancy way of saying Coleman did the one thing nobody, including the enemy, could possibly anticipate. He drove straight into hell and somehow brought us back out. The limestone caves of Quang Province still bear scorch marks on their ceilings, silent testimony to a day when conventional warfare was turned on its head by a single decision. The locals avoid certain passages, claiming the spirits of the dead linger there. Military instructors at Quantico include the incident in advanced tactical courses, though opinions remain divided on whether it represents a model to follow or a cautionary tale. Perhaps the final word belongs to Marcus Coleman himself, who rarely spoke about the incident. When pressed by a journalist at a veterans reunion in 1989, he shrugged and said simply, "When every option is bad, sometimes you have to create a new one." In the decades since, military theorists have dissected every aspect of what came to be known as Coleman's charge, the moment when a single Marine drove into darkness and emerged having changed the course of a war, if only for a moment. What separates tactical genius from suicidal recklessness? Where is the line between courage and madness, and how do we evaluate decisions made in seconds that reverberate for decades? In a quiet Veterans Administration hospital in Arizona, 94-year-old Thomas Ramirez still wakes some nights, feeling the heat of those flames on his face. "People ask if Coleman was crazy," he told his nurse recently. Maybe he was, but sometimes you need a little crazy to survive. April 23, 1973. As American forces completed their withdrawal from Vietnam, intelligence analysts compiled final assessments of the conflict's pivotal moments. In a classified addendum to the official history, Coleman's cave incident received a single paragraph. It noted that NVA strategic documents captured in the final days of the war referenced the event as the Day of Fire, marking it as the point when Northern commanders first recognized that American forces had adapted to tunnel and cave warfare in ways their strategic planning hadn't anticipated. The paradigm shift came too late to alter the war's outcome, but military instructors still study the psychological impact of Coleman's action, how a single act of audacity can disrupt enemy assumptions more effectively than conventional operations. When Captain Howard, Coleman's former commanding officer, learned of this assessment, he penned a letter to the Marine Corps Historical Division that was only declassified in 2005. "We spend millions training Marines to follow protocols and procedures," Howard wrote. "Perhaps we should spend a little more teaching them when to throw the rulebook away." The monsoon season of 1968 stands as one of the most brutal in recorded Vietnamese history. The same rain that limited American air operations created conditions where conventional tactics became not merely ineffective, but counterproductive. In this environment, Coleman's decision represented something beyond tactical innovation. It was adaptation in its purest form. Military historians note that following the cave incident, NVA forces significantly modified their approach to underground facilities. Cave entrances were narrowed, making vehicle entry impossible. Multiple choke points were established within each tunnel system. Ammunition and fuel were stored in separated chambers with blast walls between them. These modifications required substantial resources and manpower, diverting both from other operations. In effect, Coleman's single action forced systematic changes across the enemy's entire underground infrastructure. The strategic value of this disruption cannot be calculated in conventional terms. Dr. Eleanor Richards, writing in Asymmetrical Warfare: Psychological Operations in Vietnam, suggests that Coleman's action transcended military significance. The North Vietnamese had cultivated a carefully constructed narrative of the American soldier, she writes. He was technologically dependent, reluctant to engage in close combat, and psychologically unprepared for the underground war. Coleman's charge shattered this narrative in a single moment, creating psychological ripples that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The military debriefing of Coleman, conducted during his recovery at Camp Pendleton, reveals a man struggling to articulate his own decision-making process. When asked why he drove into the cave rather than withdrawing, Coleman initially claimed he was disoriented by the ambush. Later in the same interview, he admitted the decision was deliberate, but insisted it was based on logical assessment rather than impulse. "The cave was the only available cover," he stated. "Once inside, I observed enemy supplies vulnerable to incendiary attack. The tactical opportunity outweighed the risk of continued engagement in an inferior position." The interviewing officer noted skepticism about this explanation. Few combat veterans believed anyone could make such calculations in the seconds available to Coleman. More likely, the report suggested, Coleman acted on instinct and constructed a rational explanation afterward. What makes Coleman's case particularly fascinating is how it disrupts conventional understanding of combat psychology. Military training creates standardized responses to threat situations, mental shortcuts that allow soldiers to act effectively under stress without conscious deliberation. Coleman's action fell completely outside these standardized responses, yet proved devastatingly effective. The Marine Corps' initial uncertainty about how to respond to the incident reflected this contradiction. Coleman's Silver Star citation carefully framed his action as quick thinking under fire, rather than acknowledging its revolutionary nature. The accompanying reprimand for protocol violations seemed almost obligatory, an institutional acknowledgement that while the outcome was desirable, the method could not be officially sanctioned. 3 months after the incident, Coleman was transferred to a training command at Camp Lejeune. His combat tour was over, but his impact on Marine Corps doctrine was just beginning. Without explicitly referencing Coleman, new training modules emphasized tactical adaptability in confined spaces and improvised responses to subterranean engagement. Thomas Ramirez recovered from his injuries and returned to combat operations with a different unit. In personal correspondence recently donated to the Marine Corps Museum, Ramirez described how the cave incident changed his understanding of warfare. "Before that day, I believed victory came from superior firepower properly applied," he wrote to his brother. "Now I understand that sometimes victory comes from doing the one thing your enemy has never prepared for, because no sane person would attempt it." The NVA soldiers who survived the cave fire told their own stories. Through intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations, American intelligence pieced together the North Vietnamese perspective. Senior Lieutenant Thin was posthumously promoted for his leadership under extraordinary circumstances. His final command, directing his men toward secondary exits while he remained to organize the defense, saved dozens of lives. In Vietnamese military academies, the incident is studied as an example of American unpredictability rather than conventional tactics. Instructors emphasize that while Coleman's action proved effective in that specific circumstance, it reflected a broader American willingness to accept catastrophic risk, a characteristic that made U.S. forces simultaneously dangerous and vulnerable. The psychological impact extended beyond military considerations. For the Vietnamese civilians living near the cave system, the incident reinforced complex perceptions of American forces. Local accounts collected by anthropologists describe the Americans as both terrifying and unpredictable, like natural disasters given human form. As years passed, the cave incident faded from official military discourse. Coleman retired from the Marines as a major in 1983, settling in northern Michigan, where he worked as a high school history teacher. Former students recall his reluctance to discuss his service, though he occasionally used military examples to illustrate concepts of decision-making under pressure. The limestone cave system itself became a tourist attraction after the war, though guides rarely mention its military significance. The main chamber, scene of Coleman's desperate action, collapsed in 1992 after decades of structural weakening from the intense heat of that day. When military theorist Colonel John Boyd developed his influential OODA loop concept, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, in the 1970s, he specifically referenced the cave incident as an example of getting inside the enemy's decision cycle. By acting in a way that fell completely outside NVA tactical expectations, Coleman had paralyzed their response mechanism long enough to achieve his objective. The critical factor, Boyd wrote, was not the physical destruction of enemy forces, significant though that was. The critical factor was the destruction of the enemy's cognitive model of how Americans would behave in that situation. This observation points to perhaps the most enduring legacy of Coleman's action, its demonstration that warfare ultimately occurs in the mind before it manifests on the battlefield. By collapsing the distinction between unthinkable and executable actions, Coleman achieved what military theorists now call psychological dominance, the ability to act in ways your opponent cannot predict or counter because they fall outside established patterns. Marcus Coleman passed away quietly in 2014 at age 78, having never written a memoir or given extensive interviews about his service. His funeral was attended by 16 former Marines who had served under his command at various points. Thomas Ramirez, by then using a wheelchair, delivered a eulogy that carefully avoided specific mention of the cave incident. Some men, Ramirez said, carry fire within them. Most keep it carefully contained. A few, when circumstances demand, know exactly when to let it loose. In the Tactical Operations Center at Quantico, where Marine officers study historical engagements, Coleman's action is now presented alongside more conventional operations. Instructors emphasize that its value lies not in its replicability. No one suggests driving vehicles into enemy-held caves as standard procedure, but in its demonstration of tactical thinking unrestrained by doctrine. Major Jennifer Ortega, who teaches advanced small unit tactics, frames the lesson precisely. Coleman's action matters not because he used a vehicle and flamethrower in a cave. It matters because he recognized when existing tactical options had failed and created a new option where none previously existed. This perspective reshapes understanding of what happened in that Vietnamese cave. Coleman's decision was not a desperate gamble or suicidal charge, but a rational creation of a new tactical reality. When all conventional options promised failure, he invented an unconventional option that provided at least the possibility of success. The human cost of that invention remains difficult to calculate. Vietnamese records list 243 deaths in the cave system that day. American forces counted 5 Marines killed during the initial ambush. Coleman himself carried both physical and psychological scars for the remainder of his life. His medical records, released to historians after his death, document decades of treatment for respiratory problems and recurring nightmares. Yet perhaps the true cost extends beyond these immediate casualties. Coleman's action represented a philosophical breach, a moment when the rules governing warfare bent under the pressure of survival. Such breaches, while sometimes necessary, carry long-term implications for how we understand military ethics and the boundaries of acceptable combat behavior. In 2019, the U.S. Naval Institute Press published Unconventional Victories Case Studies in Adaptive Warfare, which dedicated a chapter to the cave incident. The authors interviewed aging veterans from both sides of the conflict, including a former NVA soldier who had been stationed at a secondary entrance when the fire began. "The American truck appeared like a demon from hell," he recalled. "We had been told Americans feared caves, that they would never enter our underground spaces. Then suddenly there was this vehicle in our most secure location, and everything we believed about the enemy collapsed along with our position." This testimony highlights what military psychologists call the certainty disruption effect, the moment when fundamental assumptions about an adversary are violently disproven, creating cascading psychological impacts that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The cave incident challenges conventional military history in another significant way. It represents an engagement with no witnesses except its participants, no objective verification except its outcome. Coleman and Ramirez provided the only American perspective. Most NVA soldiers present didn't survive to share their experience. The event exists in a kind of historical shadowland, known primarily through its effects rather than direct observation. This evidentiary limitation mirrors a broader truth about combat, that its reality often remains accessible only to those who experienced it directly. The fog of war is not merely a tactical challenge, but a historiographical one as well. Yet the impact of Coleman's action on military thinking remains undeniable. In the decades since, military forces worldwide have modified their approach to underground warfare, developing specialized equipment and tactics that recognize the unique challenges of subterranean combat. Modern military planners acknowledge that no defensive position, however seemingly impregnable, can be considered secure against innovative attack. The most profound legacy, however, may be philosophical rather than tactical. Coleman's action embodied what military theorist Karl von Clausewitz called military genius, the ability to make effective decisions amid the chaos and uncertainty of combat. This genius does not consist in following established doctrine, but in recognizing when doctrine has reached its limits. As warfare continues to evolve, with new technologies and battle spaces constantly emerging, the lesson of Coleman's cave remains relevant. Adaptation is not merely a tactical advantage, but a survival imperative. The ability to think beyond established parameters, to create options where none previously existed, represents perhaps the most valuable military skill of all. On a granite bench outside the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, a small plaque bears a quote attributed to an anonymous veteran: "The greatest weapon in any arsenal is a mind unbound by convention." Though no direct reference connects this statement to Marcus Coleman, those familiar with his story recognize its relevance. In the final analysis, the significance of Coleman's action transcends its immediate tactical success. It serves as a reminder that warfare, despite its increasingly technological nature, remains fundamentally human, shaped by individual decisions made in moments of extreme stress, when the gap between survival and destruction may be bridged only by actions that appear at first glance to be forms of madness. Yet as Marcus Coleman demonstrated on that rainy February day in 1968, such apparent madness may sometimes be the most rational response available. By driving into darkness, he illuminated a truth about combat that continues to resonate across generations. When conventional wisdom fails, unconventional action becomes not merely an option but a necessity. Thomas Ramirez, who witnessed that necessity firsthand, perhaps expressed it most succinctly in his final interview, given 6 months before his death in 2021. "Everyone focuses on Coleman driving into the cave," he said. "The real story is what happened in his mind seconds before. That moment when he looked at an impossible situation and decided to redefine what was possible. This redefinition, this cognitive leap from established tactics to innovative action, represents the true legacy of what happened in that Vietnamese cave. It reminds us that in warfare's most desperate moments, victory may depend not on superior resources or conventional advantage, but on the willingness to think beyond established boundaries and act with decisive audacity. As new generations of military leaders study historical engagements for applicable lessons, the cave incident continues to prompt essential questions. How do we train for unpredictability? Can audacity be taught or only recognized and rewarded? And perhaps most importantly, how do we distinguish between reckless improvisation and necessary innovation when the boundaries between them often become clear only in retrospect? These questions have no simple answers. They remind us that military judgment remains an art as well as a science, guided by principles, but ultimately expressed through human decision-making in all its complexity and contradictions. The limestone caves of Quang Nam Province have largely returned to their natural state in the decades since the war. Local guides occasionally mention the battle that occurred there, though details have faded into legend rather than history. Yet somewhere in those shadowed recesses, the echoes of Coleman's desperate gamble remain, a reminder that warfare's most decisive moments often occur not in the grand strategies of commanders, but in the split-second decisions of those facing death directly. And perhaps that, ultimately, is the most important legacy of Marcus Coleman's improbable victory. The recognition that amid warfare's chaos and horror, individual human courage and creativity retain the power to alter history's course, even if only for a moment, even if at terrible cost.